Imagine you're seated at an imperial table. The oil lamps gutter low, platters steam, wine goes around in goblets carved with the emperor's likeness. Conversation is careful, measured laughter, guarded compliments. Then the emperor rises. There is a hush as he moves toward a woman at the far end of the hall. She is led away, not by invitation, but at the command of the ruler. You are expected to laugh when he jokes. You are expected to applaud when he praises you. You are expected to look away when he takes what he pleases. You smile. You must smile. That scene, private humiliation made public, is the key to understanding Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula. His name conjures cruelty, madness, excess. But beyond the caricature lies a deliberate machine, 5 intimate weapons that transformed emotion, family, law, and honor into instruments of terror. These were not random acts of depravity. According to ancient accounts and later historians' readings of them, Caligula systematized humiliation. He taught officials, soldiers, and citizens where the lines of safety ended, and then crossed them. What follows is an attempt to reconstruct those 5 mechanisms, to separate what ancient writers recorded from what they might have amplified, and to show how a ruler turned intimacy into statecraft. If you want more deep dives like this, subscribe. This channel specializes in the darker corners of history. Before we get to the 5 shocking intimate secrets, we need the origin story, the child who became an apparatus of fear. He was born to mythic expectations. Germanicus, his father, was beloved by Roman soldiers and people alike. The infant Gaius, later nicknamed Caligula after the small caligae boots he is said to have worn with his father's troops, grew up under a public that remembered his father as a hero. But public affection does not inoculate a child against trauma. In the powder keg household of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, deaths and political purges were ordinary hazards. Germanicus died under suspicious circumstances in Syria when Gaius was still very young. Tiberius, the next emperor, was both guardian and, by some accounts, tormentor. Much of Caligula's formative years, according to later sources, were spent on Capri, the island where Tiberius retired in the latter part of his reign, and where, ancient writers insist, corruption and cruelty thrived behind the villas and groves. Tacitus and Suetonius, writing decades after the events, paint Capri as a place of moral rot and psychological conditioning. Whether every tale of depravity is true is debated by historians, yet what matters for our purpose is pattern, an early life shaped by bereavement, by proximity to arbitrary power, and by exposure to the instruments that turn the personal into the political. These conditions did not just make a volatile man, they taught a young ruler how the architecture of authority could be used to rewrite human relationships. Secret 1. Weaponized mourning, turning grief into law. Picture a public funeral. Normally, mourning is private, a painstaking, slow work of sorrow. Under Caligula, grief could become a political badge or a weapon. Ancient sources claim he elevated his sister Drusilla, often spelled Diricilla or Drusilla, some manuscripts vary, to a quasi-divine status after her death. This was not simple memorialization. According to Suetonius and other writers, the emperor remodeled ritual so that private feeling was policed and public displays of ordinary life could be criminalized. The sanctification of a sibling, already an intimate familial act, became a way to delegate power, to decide who could express what emotion and when. The mechanism here is subtle and civilizing. Law and religion merged into a single instrument of control. By sacralizing personal loss, the emperor could proclaim certain emotions off-limits or mandatory. If the emperor's grief required public demonstrations, then failure to perform grief became political suspicion. Conversely, if the emperor declared joy inappropriate or offensive, private celebrations could be denounced. In a society where reputation and honor were everything, this was devastating. A noble family found their calendar of life, birthdays, weddings, household feasts, subject to imperial judgment. The quotidian rhythms of intimacy were now regulated by decrees and the emperor's personal whims. We should be clear, historians debate the exact contours of this weaponized mourning. Suetonius, writing around a century after Caligula, had motives and a taste for sensational detail. Tacitus, too, carries moral outrage across his pages. Still, the broader point is indisputable. When grief becomes state policy, human bonds are subordinated to spectacle. People learn to behave as if their deepest feelings are both visible and vulnerable. That social lesson is in itself a form of long-term coercion. Secret 2. The alleged imperial brothel, commodifying honor through bureaucracy. This next claim is one of the most controversial and thus one of the most revealing about how Caligula's system functioned. Several ancient writers report that the emperor converted part of the imperial household into what might be described as a state-run brothel, or that he forced noble families to sell their daughters or place them in the emperor's control. Some accounts even speak of ledgers and lists that recorded names and payments. Before you imagine invoices and spreadsheets laid out on a table, pause. These descriptions come to us filtered through hostile memoir and senatorial gossip, and many modern scholars urge caution in taking every line at face value. Why does this allegation matter if it might be exaggerated? Because it highlights a technique, bureaucratic normalization of personal violation. Imagine a functionary stamping a ledger, a bureaucrat recording the emperor's allotments. Suetonius enjoys theatrical detail. Cassius Dio, later and equally judgmental, offers his own dramatic reconstructions. Consider each vignette as a slice of a larger pattern rather than a discrete episode of scandal. The important takeaway is structural. The emperor made communal events into tests of loyalty and instruments of humiliation. Secret 4. The forced grieving experiment, cruelty as social experiment. If weaponized mourning regularized grief and the banquet turned hospitality into ritualized dominance, Caligula's next move, reported by ancient commentators, was to stage grief as a deliberate experiment. One of the most shocking stories recorded by later writers involves an execution ordered by the emperor, followed by a command that family members dine or entertain while the corpse is still warm. Tacitus and Suetonius relate variations of this theme: a son executed, a father compelled to continue with public business or partake in festivities immediately after. Ancient sources present this behavior as a psychological provocation. Whether every detail is accurate is debated, but the logic they attribute to the emperor is instructive. By forcing people to perform ordinary social functions in the presence of fresh bereavement, the ruler sought to inoculate the public against natural emotional responses or to crush them. The aim was to demonstrate that even deepest bonds, parent and child, spouse and partner, could be suspended by imperial will. Emotions were not private, they were available for reconfiguration. The institutional tool here is judicial power. A sentence handed down by the emperor becomes a spectacle. Law is no longer the adjudication of civic disputes, but an instrument of social reprogramming. When an execution is used to make a political point, the judiciary performs violence not only on the body, but on the social fabric. The lesson reaches beyond the immediate victims. If you assume the role of caregiver or parent or husband, the state can force that role into dissonance with your private grief. Long term, this erodes the sense that one's family can be a refuge from the state. We must also acknowledge the moral outrage of the ancient writers. They believed such acts were signs of moral collapse. Whether Caligula aimed at social engineering or these anecdotes reflect senatorial propaganda, the stories tell us how an intimate act, grief, could be flipped into governance. Secret 5. The wrong man, dignity, provocation, and assassination. All systems have pressure points. The final secret in our list is how Caligula's particular machine of intimacy and humiliation produced its own fatal feedback.
The emperor's habit of provoking and shaming members of the military and praetorian ranks, according to sources, culminated in a fatal miscalculation. One account, notably preserved in Suetonius and later in broader historical tradition, centers on a praetorian centurion named Cassius Chaerea.
Chaerea is reported to have been mocked repeatedly by the emperor for his voice and for other personal traits, insulted in public, lampooned at feasts. Where other elite targets could silently accept or maneuver politically, the soldier had the instruments of force at hand. Humiliation, when he endured too much of it, turned into lethal resolve. In a narrow, dark corridor of the palace, a coup became murder. The emperor was stabbed again and again. In the aftermath, according to later sources, his wife Caesonia and their daughter, born only months earlier, were killed in the chaotic fall. Sources differ on details. Some confuse names and timelines, others fill silences with rumor. Still, the arc is coherent. A ruler who teaches that intimacy is a state instrument risks provoking a violent reaction from the one group whose power is physical and immediate, the military. This episode is crucial not only for its drama, but for its lessons about structural danger. Caligula's system depended on a balance. The army had to remain loyal. The bureaucracy had to implement humiliation without revolt, and the elite had to accept public dishonor. When an actor within that system, someone with arms and grievance, decides the costs are intolerable, the system snaps. The assassination was swift and brutal, described in terse, urgent beats by our sources. It did not restore dignity. In the chaos, other brutalities followed. The killings were personal and political, and they reveal how the emperor's intimate tactics made enemies out of those closest to power. The assassination also exposes the limits of personal culpability. You can imagine Caligula's individual blame. Historians do. But the deeper problem was the institutionalization of humiliation. When the state has been trained to use intimacy as a weapon, then anyone in that state can be weaponized, or can turn the weapon back on its wielder. The narrow corridor, a quick reconstruction. To visualize the assassination without indulging in gore, a corridor, marble cool underfoot, guards milling. The emperor, perhaps returning from a private audience or from a late feast, is set upon. The first blow is swift and meant to disable. Others follow to finish the act. The attackers do not hesitate to fling themselves into the personal space of an emperor, because the emperor himself had invaded the private spaces of so many others. The blunt arithmetic of retaliation is simple. Insult a man with arms for long enough, and one day you'll find him at your throat. Aftermath: Claudius, the purge, and the erasure of records. The death of Caligula did not end what he had built. In the immediate aftermath, the political class scrambled. The Praetorian Guard, which had the power and the presence to pick emperors, declared Claudius, Caligula's uncle, emperor. Claudius presents an ironic coda to Caligula's reign. A scholarly man of the family, suddenly thrust into the role his nephew had abused. What followed, according to the narrative conserved by later writers, was an effort to contain the fallout. Perhaps most consequential for historians is what Claudius is said to have done to the record. Certain documents, letters, and imperial notes were allegedly destroyed or hidden. Ancient texts indicate that parts of Caligula's private correspondence were purged, whether to protect the imperial family's reputation, to avoid further scandal, or to eliminate administrative tools of abuse. This loss helps explain why our portrait of Caligula remains cracked and contradictory. The main surviving narratives, principally Suetonius and Tacitus, appeared decades later, and both wrote from vantage points colored by senatorial concern and moralizing impulses. Where records were burned or disappeared, rumor and political memory rushed in to fill the void. That means the stories we repeat now are as much about the anxieties of the Roman elite as they are about the emperor himself. The political aftermath also demonstrates another terrible lesson. Systemic practices outlive their founders. The techniques Caligula used, instrumentalizing ceremony, converting law into spectacle, turning intimacy into a governmental domain, did not vanish with his corpse. Other emperors learned from the collapse. They saw how imperial ritual could coerce, how bureaucracy could normalize abuse, and how military loyalty could be bought or bargained. Nero and Commodus, in their own very different ways, inherited frameworks that had been stressed and shaped under earlier Julio-Claudian precedents. So what are we left with? Not a tidy moral, but a pattern. Caligula's most intimate acts were not simply private vices. They were political lessons. How to harness emotional life for governance, and how to repurpose institutions to make that harnessing efficient and durable. Assessing sources, what we can and cannot claim. At this point, a responsible historian steps back and lists the caveats. Most of what we know about Caligula is filtered through hostile lenses. Suetonius, writing in the early 2nd century AD, collected scandal and anecdote, often without our modern standards of source criticism. Tacitus offers an equally moralizing but differently structured narrative. Cassius Dio, later still, brings his own interpretive slant. Where sources disagree, where chronology becomes fuzzy, or where entire archives were likely destroyed under Claudius or otherwise lost, we must proceed with humility. That doesn't mean we must dismiss every troubling account. It means we must weigh them. When multiple political writers independently describe similar tactics, humiliation at banquets, the use of funerary honor as political tool, the emperor's cruelty towards soldiers, that repetition becomes informative. The precise details of who said what, who said it when, and who might have had motive to exaggerate remain points of scholarly debate. But a pattern of institutionalized intimidation appears robust. A broader lesson: institutions teach behavior. If there is a single argument that brings these 5 secrets together, it is this: tyrants do not merely act, they build practices into a polity. Caligula's reign is often reduced to the image of a madman gone wild. That image is useful for moral condemnation, but it obscures the way systemic changes took root. Rituals, legal decrees, bureaucratic lists, military customs, each became a lever to pry open private life and reorganize it around the leader's will. Those levers do more than harm in the moment. They circulate. Courtiers learn which jokes will keep them alive. Administrators learn how to file human beings under new categories. Soldiers learn the cost of loyalty and the power of collective violence. Once those lessons have been taught, the next ambitious ruler does not have to invent cruelty anew. They have a highly effective manual in social practice and institutional memory. Why should this ancient story matter to us now? Because the transformation of intimacy into an instrument of governance is not exclusive to Rome. Across time and place, the same techniques, from legal redesign to spectacle, have been used to erode private life and civic trust. Thinking about Caligula's methods helps us see how easily social norms can be reconstituted when power seeks to own not only action but feeling. A final image and question. Imagine one last time that banquet hall. The emperor takes what he wants. The guest smiles, though it is not a real smile. The lamps are gilded, the wine sweet. Outside, the city hums unaware. Inside,
People are learning the new grammar of survival, how to present grief on command, how to remind the emperor of your loyalty, how to measure your love so that it won't offend. That grammar once existed in Rome. It was taught by a single household and then passed into the state. So here is the question that follows the title. Why do these intimate instruments of power still matter to us? Because the way a society organizes shame, pleasure, and sorrow tells us as much about its politics as its laws. Because when intimacy becomes a public tool, trust dies slowly, and institutions become weapons. If you want to read the ancient testimonies yourself, the main narratives come from Suetonius, early 2nd century, and Tacitus, late 1st to early 2nd century, with later reflection in Cassius Dio. Keep in mind the time gap between events and their recording, and remember that fragments of imperial correspondence were likely destroyed or hidden in the immediate aftermath, which created gaps that rumor and political memory filled. For more on how these stories are debated in modern scholarship, check the sources linked below and watch our related video on the Julio-Claudian archival silence.
If this excavation of Caligula's private machinery interested you, there's more in the description. Primary sources, recommended readings, and a related episode about how imperial ritual became a tool of governance in later Roman emperors. Share this with someone who loves dark historical dives, and consider subscribing if you want more reconstructions like this.